Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Media Talks. I'm Tony J, and if you're here, click the like, share, and subscribe for more notifications coming down the pipeline. Uh, I guess today is going to be a different video, right? I really wanted to start to show off. We're going to do something different. This show is going to be called Retrospectives, right? And in my previous video, I said that we were going to look at some public service announcements from 30, maybe 40 years ago. But I wanted to start this part of the show segment out with the general idea of nostalgia. Now, you might be asking, in some respect, what is nostalgia? How do we get to a point where when we think about nostalgia, we think of something that really in reality is a part of a bygone era? So, if you think about it, what is the true definition of nostalgia? You know, and most people, when we think of nostalgia, it's basically a feeling, a longing for something, thinking fondly of the past, the times, or the conditions of that time period. Um, when one thinks about nostalgia, one thinks happiness, and I think that when we really look at this idea of nostalgia, we're thinking, okay, man, I miss those days, or man, ain't nothing like the good old days. It's this longing, this idea that we can look back on something and have a feeling of happiness about that time period, I guess you would say. Um, say for instance, you have a movie or an old record, and when you put that old record on, it takes you back to a time where it brings back a memory in your mind of what it felt like being there, witnessing it for the first time. Like, I could remember the first time I fell in love with hip hop, or I could remember the first time that this song came on, and me and this girl I had a crush on. So it nostalgia in that sense means a yearning for the past or a recollection of the past. When we think about public service announcements and advertising in general, we think about this idea that PSAs conjure up certain feelings, some positive, some negative, right? And in most people's eyes, when one sees a public service announcement, one has a feeling of maybe disgust, or maybe some other people have feelings of, man, I remember that. I remember that commercial. Even though it was 30 seconds, I remember it very vividly. Because you have to remember in television, you only get about 30 seconds to see something. Most average people can't remember every commercial that comes on TV. But with the mind, what I've read, and don't quote me on this one neither. Don't quote me on this one. But what makes advertising special is that one can actually remember over 1,000 commercials in their lifetime, maybe 1,000. And the ones that stick out the most usually have a jingle attached to them. Something catchy, something that people can remember. And I think when you think back to the 90s, I think in one way, I think that most people would say the 90s was a time period of massive amounts of television, right? Most of us who grew up during that time period can remember food commercials and TV commercials in between the cartoons or whatever we watched on TV, right? But for us, for the people that grew up during my time period, um, public service announcements was kind of one of those things where they were delivering information and also educating the public on certain specific issues, whether it be minute or a major issue like maybe drugs, um, sometimes buckle up your safety belt, with the crash test dummy. So public service announcements really served a purpose. Public service announcements made an instrumental. It had a purpose in educating massive amounts of people, but it also really educated children. So when we talk about nostalgia, when we go back to that time period, people say the 90s was the greatest time period of our lives because things were economically sufficient and people could afford to have jobs that could put two kids through school, college. You could work at McDonald's and have a 1-bedroom apartment back then. But then there are also people that remember the 90s as being the era of the domestic terrorists. In fact, when people talk about the 90s, most of the time they don't factor in some of the darker aspects of the 90s, right? For the last 20 years, we've been talking about the 90s. There's been shows, there's been reboots. In this era, the 90s are still a very popular time period that people still discuss and still sit around a table and talk about. There's Facebook groups dedicated to 90s nostalgia. So when you think about it, nostalgia has a tendency to kill the imagination, and also when you play in it, you miss the other aspects of how the time period actually went. So when people write about the time period, they say, well, for some people who grew up as children in the 90s, we remember it as being an innocent period. We don't remember it as being a dark period. But for those who were teenagers and those who were going into early adulthood, remember the darker periods. They remember the shoe bomber. They remember the Olympic bombing of 96. They remember Columbine. They remember the drugs, the crack epidemic. And it's those things that in reality, they have a tendency to, we get lost in it. And when we get lost in it, we forget the negative aspects of it. And that's one of the scary things about PSAs. There's a nostalgia there, but there's also the issue of forgetting that there's a lot of hyperbole with those public service announcements. Most public service announcements, like the ones for the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, are often looked at by many individuals as being the most scary, cringeworthy group of public service announcements out there because of the hyperbole. And then when you look back at it 20 years later, 20 or 30 years later, you realize how nonsensical some of those public service announcements were. Now, some of them were very important. Some of them actually dug deep into the consequences of using drugs, but also they actually unintentionally promoted drug use by promoting it as a product. And that is the irony of Partnership for a Drug-Free America, is you can tell people this is what this drug do, this is what this drug does to the body, and if you take it, if you consume it, this is what will happen. If you snort heroin, eventually you'll end up on a needle. Those types of things were very important. I don't push that aside, right? But then there are also the anti-marijuana ads, which were literally came off with really ridiculous statements that it slows the reaction time of the brain, that these these marijuana could actually cause you to crash a train and derail a train. Like there were so many PSAs out during that time that were about anti-marijuana, and majority of them came out of Partnership for a Drug-Free America. The funny thing about those ads is that we could look back at those ads and kind of realize how stupid they really were, right? I can't tell you the amount of public service announcement ads that I was able to just look back on and say to myself how ridiculous those ads were. And looking at those ads, I realized how much I really kind of I really said to myself, I'm like, what's the point of this? And like I said, with nostalgia attitudes, the attitudes of drug use have changed. Um, Also, besides the anti-drug ads, there's also the McGruff the Crime Dog ads. And I didn't grow up in the '80s. I didn't grow up in the '80s, but some of you that are watching this might have grown up in the '80s, and maybe in reality, some of you have watched the Stranger Danger phenomenon that came about during the mid to late '80s, and told you, if there was a stranger, if there was a person, don't talk to strangers. And the reality was, and you look back on those ads, you realize most people don't kidnap kids unless it's somebody that they really truly know. I don't think anybody goes around just randomly kidnapping kids. It's just like um going back to the anti-drug campaigns. Most of the anti-drug campaigns that came on during Saturday morning cartoons and maybe morning TV shows for kids were aimed at drug education. So they use cartoons and say, what happens if somebody gives you drugs? I tell them take a hike, and all this other stupid shit. Like in the '90s, like they had all of those ads, and then you realize, I'm like, who the fuck is selling drugs to kids? If you think about it, who's selling drugs to a 10-year old? They not did no 10-year old has no 10-year old has money for crack. No 10-year old has money for drugs. And what dealer is going to sell to a kid? You ask yourself that, and I'm like, it didn't make any fucking sense. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe back then it did. But looking back now, to me, and maybe to some of you, it didn't make any sense. I'm gonna break down a couple of let's see. I'm gonna break down a couple of ads that I remember growing up. Um, you know, I'll see here. Okay. But if you think about it, a home PSA. So let's see. You think about it, there were a few impactful ones that I truly liked. You know, I would say they were some of my favorites. Um, you know, I mean, let's check out this one, right? Because the long way home is one of my favorite PSAs. And I like that PSA because the Partnership for a Drug-Free America really delved deep into this idea that when it comes to the drug epidemic in America, most people can't say no. And a lot of people whom I grew up with the slogan of just say no, I think many people who were non white understood the circumstances behind just say no. And when we make up these slogans, when we make up these ads talking about whenever somebody gives you drugs, just say no. It was an empty rhetoric that Nancy Reagan really didn't think about completely. Now, in hindsight, I think their program was really good. I think that program really helped to educate, really kept a lot of kids off of drugs while they were in school. But then, you know, one of the pitfalls of DARE is, most public schools are right near corner stores in the city, in the inner city. And most of the time, when these people write these slogans and people forget, like these companies that write these slogans, they didn't never factored in how it might be impacting the urban community. And I think where Partnership for a Drug Free America does right is they come out with a PSA that does does it justice to really, you know, focus in on what it feels like to grow up in an inner city neighborhood as a black kid. And what I find very interesting and intriguing about this particular public service announcement is that it really gets to the it really gets to the idea of the child, right? The child is the subject of the commercial. It feels like a movie, but it also feels like it's everyday life growing up in a black neighborhood where this young man sees crack dealers and drug dealers outside his place of residence. And he has to find a way to navigate and circumvent them to keep him from getting into the street life. So he runs down an alley to take an alternate detour to get back home from school. Every kid has experienced that. Every kid has experienced it. If you really look at it, it looks like a miniature version of Fresh, right? Even though the plot looks like it's there, it's kind of like it to me, it kind of reminded me of a small little miniature version of Fresh. But the thing that really intrigued me about this commercial is that it debunks the myth about black people only selling drugs. And then you have one which I consider one of the worst ones, in which the Partnership for a Drug-Free America got wrong. And we're going to check that out. I'm going to give a separate commentary on that, but this one, I want us to watch this one first, and then we could come back, and then I'll have a dialogue about the the commercial and the clip. But this one was good, and then the one where the guy turns into a snake, that's the worst one. That one was, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, it was 1986. I can completely understand why they went that route, but they went the wrong way with that clip. And then they turned it around and they got it right. And this is what I talk about with media, is sometimes when we look back at certain things, we don't get the hyperbole of it. And in this case, there's a racial dynamic tied to these two ads. And the racial component is one of the things that I really wanted to hit on with these two ads. You know, being that this was the 80s, some people might excuse it. Other people, maybe in my generation, might not excuse it. We didn't understand the context back then, how bad the drug wars really were. But maybe I can understand now, looking back at it, how truly bad it really was. So, let's watch this 30-second clip, and then I'll be right back.
teacher tells us all we gotta do is just say no. And the other day, a policeman came to our class talking about say no too. But my teacher doesn't have to walk home through this neighborhood. And maybe the dealers are scared of the police. But they're not scared of me. And they sure don't take no for an answer.
To Kevin Scott and all the other kids who take the long way home, we hear you. Don't give up.
Okay, so we looked at the first public service announcement. And like I said, The Long Way Home was one of those interesting commercials where it, if you look at it, it's impactful, it's emotional, and it draws the viewer in. Um, as I stated before, those are the type of public service announcements that were really impactful for their time. And when you look back at it, it's probably one of the best ones that the Partnership for a Drug Free America actually did, because it was like, okay, well, they got it right. They got it right. They tuned in and they engaged with the inner city in a way where most anti-drug commercials didn't get it right. Now, I want to look at the next clip from 1986, which was it. It was one of the most horrid clips that I would say was the worst one, because this one has, like I said, a racial element to it. And because it has a racial element to it, most of the time, when you look at it, well, you say to yourself, okay, well, that's what drug dealers look like. They're black and they're a snake. But I like, there not only is the commercial bad, it hits on a lot of racial undertones that at the time we didn't really consider in the fight for the drug wars. So, because this was 1986 and because this was the Ronald Reagan era, there was like, okay, well, who would be the people that were selling the most drugs? So then they had to highlight blacks. And when you look at it, you don't think anything of it, but then there's the scare, the fear element attached to it. In a city, black drug dealer walks across the street, turns into a snake in the dark, gets dark, and then transforms into a snake when he comes out of the dark. But then you don't see what's going on in the background, right? And pay attention to the background. Think about what's going on. If you look in the background of the commercial in the opening, maybe 5 or 6 seconds of it, you'll see people crossing the street looking to get their fix. And you don't really, it doesn't really calculate in your mind what the commercial is trying to tell you. But the opening is, hey kids, send your mom and daddy out the room. I got to get you up on this. That's how it opens. And then you see all these black people just running across the street for crack. It's hilarious, but it's the hyperbole of it that makes it such a horrible commercial. And maybe what they were trying to do in that in essence was they were trying to get people to get kids to be scared of drug dealers. Like, if you go to the inner city, this is what a drug dealer looks like. He looks like a snake trying to give you drugs so he could get you hooked. So you looked at the undertone and the overtone. The undertone is the people running across the street. The overtone is the guy talking to the kids. He's broke the fourth wall between the commercial and the person that they're trying to talk to. And in some ways, it's an interesting commercial, but in other ways, it's very cringeworthy because, like I said, the racial undertones of the commercial itself. Why not a white person? Why not somebody that's Hispanic? Why does it have to be a black drug dealer? It's as if all black people sell drugs. So then it's just that racial undertone about it. And I think the target audience they were trying to get at is young white kids in the suburbs because they didn't know anything about crack. They thought crack was an inner city thing. So then I think the aim of the target message of the ad is basically, I'm trying to target white kids to scare white kids away from the inner city. That's the lens that I got from the ad. And if I was sitting in an executive room, which most black people at advertising firms weren't sitting at the time, I probably would have said, okay, this ad has a racial overtone to it. This ad is dangerous. And that's what I would have said. Could you have chosen another tone of reference for the ad? And that's the thing that I would have said. But you check it out for yourself and see what you think.
Hey, little dude, send your mama and daddy out of the room. I gotta get you up on this. You know who I am. Snake, dealing in weed, coke, crack, your choice. Take one hit and you'll do anything to cop more. Steal from your mama, lie, cheat on your homeboys. But hey, that's the price you pay when you deal with dudes like me. Now, some folks will tell you that I'm dealing in poison. But hey, do I look like the kind of guy that would do that to a kid like you? Yes!
Well, the next video I wanted to go into is there's another anti-crack PSA that is also focused on the inner city. But what's interesting is just like the snake PSA you just saw, this one does this process again of breaking the third wall, like a lot of drug commercials do. This one is actually very good. I will say, like, looking at it and judging it, this is probably one of the best PSAs, anti-drug PSAs that I've seen on the internet. It's a very obscure one because this one came out in 1989, and it shows the drug dealer on the playground, on the basketball court, playing with the kids. He breaks the fourth wall, then he starts talking to parents, which is the intended target audience. You know, the intended target audience of this ad was black mothers who had children who go out into the streets and think they won't get caught up in either doing crack or selling crack. And then he goes into going back into his character as the villain, and it breaks and then it goes back into it. And what the chilling part of that commercial is, I just love giving first crack out. That was the most impactful. It was the most impactful message because he breaks the fourth wall, and then he reverts back into being the villain to get the message across. The mother's delusional. They think that their kids won't sell drugs or get into crack. And he lays it down, the denials that every mother has in the back of their mind of whether or not their sons might get caught up in a drug game when they go outside to play basketball. So he makes a very, very deep point, but he also drives the message home, and it gets across very clear and succinct. It's no preaching. It's no, okay, this is what happens. And if you're in denial about the consequences, this is going to be the result. I'm going to sell your kid crack, and they're going to get hooked, and then they're going to start stealing from you. And then you're going to have to pick them up at the morgue. But I don't mind giving your son crack, because once I give him a free hit, he's going to lie, cheat, and steal to get high. Let's check it out.
Mamas like you make my job so easy when you don't tell your children just how deadly crack is. But my baby's too young, you say. Yeah, and I'm hooking them younger every day. But they don't have the money, you say. Huh. Once my customers get hooked on crack, they lie, cheat, and steal to get more. So thanks for not telling Junior about guys like me. I just love getting first crack out.
These last couple of public service announcements that I really want to focus on before I get out of here is really the celebrity endorsement. Out of all the public service announcements, the celebrity endorsement is probably one of the most powerful forms. It's interesting to think that with most advertising agencies that craft these messages in these commercials, they feel as though, well, if nobody won't listen, or if the ad won't grab the person's attention, maybe they would use a celebrity. And most times you notice a lot of commercials with public service messages use the celebrity endorsement, because most media companies feel as though celebrities can drive home the message. People will stop what they're doing if they hear somebody famous or one of their favorite movie stars talk about a serious issue. One of the more popular couple of ads that we're about to see here deal with, of course, drugs and smoking. And I wanted to bring up the Yul Brynner ad. I talked about that previously in my first video, my previous video. If you haven't gone back to that video, I want you to go back to that video and hear what I have to say about those types of commercials. The Yul Brynner commercial was one of the very more powerful commercials on anti-smoking. uh, Yul Brynner, before his death, decided that he wanted to do an anti-smoking commercial because he was suffering from lung cancer. And I had a choice between picking the original one with the John Wayne one or the Yul Brynner one. And I felt as though the Yul Brynner one was more serious. Um, the thing about the John Wayne ad, um, I didn't really particularly like the John Wayne ad because even when you think about it, John Wayne represents this ruggedness about masculinity and the involvement of men. And the thing that's so interesting about the John Wayne ads is John Wayne really is a symbol of America. And he had been a symbol of America for over 50 years. His movies impacted the tapestry of America, and he was just about as popular as Ronald Reagan was during his tenure as president. But one of the things that makes it interesting is that America has always had an issue with cigarettes. But to get somebody like Yul Brynner to deter deter people from smoking was very serious at that time when that ad came out. And you've never heard a situation where something was driven home about smoking. This man died after that message, like right after that commercial came out after his death. And it was serious because now, because he's dead from cigarette smoking and the amount of cigarette smoking he did, smoking at that time in America was as normal as maybe chewing gum. People didn't really care about secondhand smoke, and the previous generation of boomers had no care in the world about, smoking or no smoking or anti-smoking sections. They don't have those and we come, our generation is one removed from this whole thing about, a smoking or a non-smoking section at a restaurant. So it kind of really brought things home for me when looking at the ad, knowing that smoking is no longer a normalized thing anymore, you know, looking back on those ads. And then there's the other one with Clint Eastwood. I think a lot of people know Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry, and he's another person that represents the tapestry of American idealism as far as masculinity and ruggedness with all the Dirty Harry movies and everything. And they say, okay, well, people will listen to Clint Eastwood because Clint Eastwood, you know, people love Clint Eastwood, just like they love John Wayne. So when he delivers this message on crack and uh the thrill can kill, it was a serious message. Now that particular ad aired in 1986, during the time that President Reagan was putting money behind anti-drug messaging during his tenure as president. And most of the motion picture industry, which was in Hollywood at the time, because Ronald Reagan and Hollywood are kind of tied together like that. What's so interesting about that is that he put money and backing, and he had celebrity backing over the anti-drug message. So because Ronald Reagan has these ties to Hollywood, well, now the celebrity endorsement gets introduced in movie theaters. So if you were a teenager growing up in the 80s and you went to the movie theaters and you saw maybe Nancy Reagan and not Ronald Reagan, but Nancy Reagan and and Clint Eastwood in a commercial, The Thrill May Kill. They would run those ads actually in between before the movie started. So to get kids to go away from or steer them away from trying crack and trying. And then there were a couple of ads. Part of one of them was made by Michael J. Fox. Um, I forgot this other lady who played off the Breakfast Club, Ali Sneed, I believe. I don't know, don't quote me on that. Um, and then there was also another one with Bette Midler, which was aired with the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. We won't see this ad here on this episode, but I may go back and maybe touch on that ad a little bit, and I'll look back at it. And there's a short version and then there's the longer version. The longer version has both Nancy Reagan and Clint Eastwood in it, but I decided to show the smaller 30-second clip. And then the last one, of course, is one that was made by Michael Jordan in partnership with McDonald's to deter people away from drugs. I thought that one was actually very interesting, and I felt like that one was very sincere. The Michael Jordan ad didn't scare the shit out of people, as most anti-drug messaging did back in those days. It wasn't a scared straight approach to this one, but it felt like it was a sit down and it was a talk, and he was kind of like, being kind of like the ad is kind of set up like him being a mentor, and him, telling kids, you only got a third of your life left. You're only if you're 18 years old, stop doing drugs. And if you're doing them, get help and all that stuff. And it he had a softer tone. And I feel like compared to the other messages that we've seen here today on this episode, this one is probably the most effective. I would actually enjoy watching it. Michael Jordan is one of the greatest athletes of all time, but this was during his tenure, his beginning stages of his career. And I feel like looking back at it now and seeing where he is, this man went from, trying out for the Chicago Bulls. Now he's worth $6 billion. And looking back at that ad, I'm like, wow, this man was really, really special. And looking at the ad, people will like, okay, well, now the ad has more relevancy now than it did 37 years ago. And he doesn't make himself a preacher in this sense. He's not preachy, but he's kind of like talking to that person like this is your friend, I'm your mentor, I want you to get better in life and I want you to succeed. Me and McDonald's, we both want you to see a future. And that's what was so impactful about that ad. And this is why I'm closing out this episode with that ad. So looking back and what I've said about nostalgia and retrospectives, this show was basically about analyzing media. And I'm going to be doing more episodes like this, and I hope you come back and watch and consume some more content, because I'm going to be creating more content consistently on these types of media. Also, we'll talk about what's trending in the current landscape of social media as well. I'll be talking about that. I have more content coming up soon. So, you know, what I've learned and what I've taken away from analyzing these media clips is that public service announcements are still very important to society when it comes to social issues. We're living in a social media landscape that causes us to really, really think about what it means to galvanize around a social issue. And that's what's so important about public service announcements. When we were younger, media was created to inform and educate the audience. And like all media platforms, you have one that is dedicated to the public and another that is a business entity that creates entertainment. But the responsibility of a media company is to inform and to educate and not only just entertain. And I feel like we as a nation and national media today has lost that purpose and that value. And because American media now is focused on entertainment, we have lost enlightenment amongst society. And when we lose enlightenment and intellectualism that comes with media, we lose sight of what's really important. America has to get back to informing and educating. Platforms have to start informing. But a lot of media companies, especially journalism companies, do not inform, they simply entertain. And I think looking back on public service announcements, it's something that has become a thing of the past, has become a thing of the analog age, the age of the rabbit ear television. When I was young, people used to sit around the TV and they used to really have conversations about certain issues. We'd have discussions. We talk about social issues. Now it seems like companies like CNN and MSNBC talk about the issues, but they don't inform nor educate because social media has taken the eyeballs away from traditional media. So I'll leave you with this. One cannot be entertained unless they become enlightened. It's okay to entertain, but it is very important that you get some enlightenment. I'm Tony J, and this has been another episode of Media Talk TV. If you're new here, hit the like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more episodes and more content. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of these clips.
Ladies and gentlemen, the the late Yul Brynner.
I really wanted to make a commercial when I discovered that I was that sick and my time was so limited. I wanted to make that commercial that says simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer. I'm convinced of that.
See this cute little vial here? It's crack, rock cocaine, the most addictive form. You think it's the glamour drug of the 80s? Well, that's the point of this friendly little reminder. It can kill you. And if you've got to die for something, this sure as hell ain't it.
You know, there's some things in life that you can do and have fun with, but there's a lot of things in life that you shouldn't do, such as drinking and driving, smoking cigarettes. They ain't no good for you. Cheating on your wife, or just getting caught, maybe. But you know something? I'm Jake the Snake Roberts, and I might play around with snakes, and I might play around with a lot of things. One thing I'd never play around with is drugs. I'm able to stand up and be a man on my own and say, no, I don't need that to have a good time. I got better ways and live longer.
I'm Michael Jordan. McDonald's restaurants have given me this time to talk to you about something we both really care about, kids. Kids are the reason McDonald's sponsors their Get It Straight program, a national drug awareness effort. McDonald's is so concerned about this problem, you won't be seeing their usual commercials during this show because McDonald's believes it deserves your undivided attention. Now I'd like to speak just to the kids for a moment. Unfortunately, when people like myself, your teachers or your parents, try to talk to you about drugs, you think we're preaching at you, and sometimes it turns you off. Though I never used drugs, when people try to tell me things for my own good, it turned me off too. But I found out something. Even though they haven't experienced what you're experiencing now, a lot of that preaching was worth it. Because when it comes to drugs, experience is not the best teacher, but growing up is a very good teacher. That's what this program is all about. Living long enough to grow up. Think about this. Many of you using drugs out there now are under 18. Do you realize that at 18 you have lived only 1/4 of your life? When you're using drugs, you're only cheating yourself out of the chance to find out who you really can be. And believe me, if you don't use drugs, you can just about be anything you want to be. When I was 18, my future was just a dream. But if I'd been on drugs, that dream would have never come true. Listen, you got at least 3/4 of your life to go. That's 3 more lifetimes to you. So don't blow it. Don't do drugs. If you're doing it, stop it. Get some help. McDonald's wants you to give yourself a chance to find out all the wonderful things you really can be. And so do I.